Hello and welcome. You're listening to Marketing Matters on the Wharton Podcast Network, our weekly podcast where we analyze the latest in advertising, marketing, customer behavior, new product launches, branding, retailing, etc. I'm Barbara Kahn, the Patty and J.H. Baker Professor of Marketing, and I'm joined by my co-host, Americus Reed, the Whitney M. Young Jr. Professor of Marketing and the Brand Identity Theorist. Hello, Americus.
Hi, Barbara. Okay, so real quick. So I've done probably 9 interviews on Cracker Barrel. I just got to get your hot take real fast.
It's amazing to me. You wouldn't believe this, but I'm actually doing research on those kind of minimalist brand logos. And it's so clear to me that if you have a logo that's steeped in legacy and history, you don't throw the whole thing away.
Yeah.
And I heard your talks on all sorts of media, and your basic point is, did you test the damn thing?
Yes. But it's amazing though, Barbara, because I grew up in the South and I've been to Cracker Barrel stores a million times and I don't know, it just seems as though, to your point, and this question of not really understanding not only your own brand identity, what's in the DNA of your brand, but also your customers. And it just seems like a mistake that just keeps on getting made over and over again. And then the other point, real quick, Barbara, thoughts on this. A 100,000 person digital board of directors who steps in and says, you're not doing that. And then you go back. What do you think about this? This is incredible.
You know, it's very interesting, and I'm really glad you brought it up because today we have with us Daphne Howland, who's a senior reporter at Retail Dive. Hello, Daphne.
Hey, it's so nice to be here.
Hey, Daphne.
And we're going to ask you to weigh in because what Americus is talking about is like these legacy brands and what when they throw their DNA away and then they go back and when the internet responds and says, "What the hell are you guys doing? Come back." We're going to talk today about some stories that you've been writing on legacy brands. We're going to talk about the Gap. We're going to talk about Victoria's Secret. We're going to talk about Dillard's and just regular malls instead of the fancy malls. And to Americus's point, I don't know, Daphne, if you remember, but Gap did the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember when Gap came up with that streamlined logo? But they invested more money in it. It's a very big deal when a retailer changes their logo because then you've got to change it on stores, on uniforms, on all of these things. And Gap did what Americus is talking about, that Cracker Barrel just did, where they had the internet tell them, what are you guys kidding? Go back to your legacy.
And at that time, if I remember correctly, right now, Cracker Barrel, which by the way, this reminds me of there's a McDonald's near us that was really sad. It clearly needed a renovation and got one, but now it's a gray box, no golden arches.
Wow.
No golden arches.
That's sacrilege.
It's weird.
But, I started to mention I am doing research on that. We're actually running some experiments on this new minimalist trend. And just, too long don't read, like that notion of it. The bottom line of our research is these minimalist logos make sense for small brands without any legacy because they're not well known. And if you make it very easy to grasp what's going on, which we call fluency, it actually helps the small brands. Alternatively, if you've built up this big legacy and have all of this tradition and brand identity, going to a minimalist logo is crazy. It's just nuts.
Now, let me ask you this, Barbara, and jump on this as well, Daphne. Is the research and sort of the boots on the ground telling us that younger consumers like these modern minimalist logos more, or what's going on? Is there anything that's generational about this in terms of preferences?
That's interesting because we didn't test that. We didn't do it by individual differences. We did it across the board. And what we basically found was that our minimalist logos work better for a brand that doesn't have legacy and less good for a brand that does, which just kind of makes sense. But now you're adding in a new twist, which is what happens if, the style, so to speak, is to streamline. Should the logos chase after these changes in styles and fashion. I think that's basically what you're saying in some sense, because the younger people are coming in with these new preferences. Are leggings tight or are they loose? Are jeans short or bell bottom or whatever? And if you chase after all of those tastes, I think it's going to be hard for a brand.
I would need research like yours, Barbara, but, if I had to bet, I would think the younger generation would want the old man in the logo.
Oh, interesting.
That would be my guess for Gen Z.
Interesting. And what's the thought
Especially
process
Gen
behind that?
Z.
Yeah,
I'm
why that
thinking
hypothesis?
it's totally anecdotal. It's based on the Gen Z kids in my life. Um, and
We
just
love
like
Anecdata.
research like that.
Yeah.
I think they're into vintage. I think they're into
Interesting.
grandpa,
Interesting.
maybe.
Interesting. So
Um,
the character is actually named Uncle Herschel, Barbara.
okay.
And it turns out that this Uncle Herschel is a real person and who was the actual uncle of the founder. So there's a lot going on there. So your point, and your point as well, Daphne, be very careful when you
Yeah,
start
right.
messing around with stuff that's been
Yeah,
around that has some
yeah.
equity associated with it.
But anecdotally, again, we can look at the data, but since we don't have it, let's look at anecdotes. I actually agree with what Daphne's saying about this younger generation, because I just recently became a grandmother. I have a 2-month-old
Oh,
grandson. And
wow.
all these cutesy grandmother names like this or that. And my daughter in law, who's just on the cusp of Z and millennial, she's just at that age. She really wants me to be called grandma. Like, I don't want a cutesy name. I actually want the support
It's
of some legacy, some tradition. And you
uh
can see that it might make sense even from that point of view.
Well, I gotta say though, Barbara, and jump in on this, Daphne. Barbara, you do not have grandma energy. Okay, you're
Right.
not ready for that social category label. I'm just gonna say that right now and put it on the record.
I'm gonna
Okay.
make it hip. We're gonna make it new. But,
Yeah.
let's get into our retail stories because there's actually a lot happening, but it's really much built on this idea. We've been talking about Gap for a long time, being bad and the shining light in the Gap portfolio. The Gap portfolio, of course, is Gap, Old Navy, Banana Republic, and Athleta. And historically, the Gap portfolio, the shining star was Athleta. But now, ironically, that's the one that's falling a little bit behind, and
Mm,
they have a new CEO at Gap. I think, well, I don't know how new he is, but he's been trying to
2
make some
years.
changes, and they've seen some real changes in Gap. Why don't you give us a little background on that, and tell us what's happening?
So, it must be said that Old Navy is their sales powerhouse.
mm.
It's not necessarily the fashion cred that even probably the other 3, Banana Republic, Athleta, and Gap, are supposed to have. Old Navy just makes the most money, like billions. Um, Gap, kind of lost its way. It was so important actually in the 90s, and it wasn't just the clothes. I mean, was it ever the clothes? We're talking about khakis and jeans and sweatshirts and stuff that's very recognizable. Um, Essentials, I don't know what you call them, basics, and that I mean,
Basics,
basic
no,
now
yes.
is an insult, right?
Yeah.
But they knew how to have a conversation. Um, a couple years ago when I looked into what exactly happened with them, where they were and where they ended up, there was a DJ talking about how Gap would actually break songs the way TikTok does now. So DJs would be hearing requests for songs that Gap would have broken, just through an ad.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
and I feel like they did it again this time with Milkshake. It's happening again. I have no idea if it's a one-off, but it has legs. I mean, we're going if you look at social media, it's still a topic of conversation. Gap, the brand itself, is posting video of ordinary people trying out the dance moves, and they're not even necessarily wearing Gap clothes, but Gap is interested enough
Huh.
in hearing back from people who connected with that ad that they're posting footage of them dancing, even if it's not an item of clothing from Gap.
So it's kinda trying to find its place in the cultural zeitgeist, is that I
Yeah.
mean, and that's a lot what we're seeing. America's that is kind of part of your whole pitch on brand identity and things like that, I believe, to find your place in the cultural so it's an interesting strategy for Gap. What do
Mhm,
you think?
mhm,
So obviously it has staying power, but like how big does that picture go? Did they crack the code finally, or
mm,
is this just a really successful one-off for them?
interesting.
Let me
And
let
that
me pose this I wanna ask you something, Americus. You put me on the spot. I wanna put you on the spot with
okay,
current events and what she just said.
okay.
So one of the things that's interesting in this whole story, this one-off or not one-off, is one of Gap's competitors, of course, is American Eagle. And
Yes,
talk about
Mhm.
yes,
something that's been controversial
yes.
recently, that
Ooh.
was the Sydney Sweeney story.
Yes.
And so if you're talking about this brand identity or tribes or cultural relevance or
Yes.
what's your take on what happened with American Eagle and
Ooh.
originally Sydney Sweeney, now it's Travis Kelce, and what Daphne's saying about Gap, they were really kind of moving in on this one particular dance thing. What do you think? How does that all work? Do these things work in
I I'm
building brands?
I think they do work, but I think they kind of you jump in on this, Daphne, and tell us this what you're seeing in the from the journalistic side. Affirm this. The idea that there's a lot of risk in what's going on with respect to these cultural moments, Barbara, because there's a group of folks that are political actors that are looking for opportunities to ride some of these cultural waves, Barbara, in a way that can take it somewhere different, right? So this whole idea of sort of ideologies and the fact that hey, Uncle Herschel or good genes. Wait a minute, what are you saying? All of these things that get amplified. And now I would have assumed that the decision calculus and the risk analysis is very different now. To Barbara's point about the fact that this double edge of trying to ride that cultural zeitgeist or figure it out or crack the code, as Barbara's saying, has a lot more risk associated with it. Would you agree with that, Daphne? Or how has the landscape changed to Barbara's point?
The the interesting thing to me is the way so many people interpreted Gap's ad, which was a very diverse. It didn't lean on one person, right? It leaned on not just the 6-member musical group, but then also this huge dance troupe. Um, it was interesting to me how many people thought that Gap answered American Eagle with this ad.
Mm.
When you look at it,
Ah.
there's no way this wasn't an ad that had been in production. I mean, it had to have been in production for months and months and
Sh-
months.
Happy accident, as they say.
Yeah, I I do think it was probably unfortunate for American Eagle because if anyone was confused about why people took the American Eagle message the way, was it intended that way? Was it not? There was this argument about it. But anyone who might have been like, "Huh? Where'd they come from?" might have the Gap ad almost answered that. Like,
Mm.
there's a way to do marketing and show our clothes showing a lot of different types of people with a lot of different style. The Some of the Sydney Sweeney's, um, you know, her messaging was confusing. I'm not gonna tell you to wear American Eagle ads jeans, like, why not? You know? Um
Isn't that the job? Yes.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah.
so it was sort of very dependent on this one person. I actually thought of Gap when I first saw this Sydney Sweeney ad before Gap came out with Milkshake, because I had done that story in 2023. If you remember those ads with there were portraits, black and white portraits, and there was Spike Lee, and there was Joan Didion, and there
Yeah,
was
yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
all these different people with the same tagline. Could it have been interesting if you had a diverse panel of superstars saying so and so has great genes instead of relying on one person?
Yeah.
that whole controversy would have been
Not
moot. They're just
existent?
not yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that's interesting. That's very
Yeah,
interesting.
and it was a funny choice, and one wonders if they, if they did it to generate the word of mouth, and then
Yeah.
they could come back. And when they did come back, after, to Americus's point, it got brand napped in some sense by people
mhm,
with a political agenda, right?
right,
Yeah,
right,
But
yeah,
then when, so I don't think they meant it that way. Personally, actually don't think they meant it that
yeah,
way. And I
I
think it
doubt
was,
it.
as you said, they were going to come out with a bunch of different versions, but then it got brand napped. But maybe they were aware that was a possibility. They should have been if they were thinking about it.
interesting.
And they came back with their response. Wasn't an apology. It was just saying, look, it's about the denim. Like, don't read into this.
Yeah,
And what ended up happening is it generated a lot of word of mouth.
yeah,
Then they follow up with Sydney Sweeney campaign, with the Travis Kelsey campaign. I mean, you're talking about a campaign and an engagement and a new album that broke the internet.
big
If
time.
the bottom line is generating word of mouth and just talking, getting your name out there, maybe it's all part of a grand scheme. I don't know.
Interesting.
Did it have a vibe of trying to change the conversation though? The Kelsey, the Travis Kelsey. I mean,
It has
that
that
seemed
just as
timed to the announcement, right? Obviously, but did it also have the feeling of like, stop looking over there, we've got something new? I don't know.
maybe, although, if you're going to go into the gene thing, having Taylor Swift and Travis
Yes,
Kelsey, I don't see that's
yes,
that much different than Sydney Sweeney on that
yes.
mention.
Right,
But
right.
I do think they're trying to go like, look over here, not over there. Let's talk about this. Let's just change this whole conversation and went in a direction we didn't want it to go.
I just want someone to write the expose because I think if they had any Gen Z members on that committee making that decision, they would have clocked that potential response that Sydney Sweeney had. So
Mhm.
my question is,
Interesting.
how many Gen Z people do you have involved in your marketing, and did you ignore them?
Yeah,
Yeah, but the problem with that also is if you have a panel of, six, you're not doing real market research, you're not getting the heterogeneity of response. That's the problem with, with anecdotes.
true.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
like
yeah,
it's not that hard to test anymore. So I think America's that's one of your big points is like
Yes,
a
yes.
panel of 1,000 is not really that hard to get.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Here's a broader question for both of you, and this is a harder question. Give me your framework, your logic, your analysis of how a company should, who has existing brand equity around its logo, around its what it does, its meaning system, like the Gap or Cracker Barrel, whatever. How does it analyze that and move to something new? What's that? What does that look like? How does that get laid out? What are the things that
Yeah.
that's a question I'm grappling with, Barbara, because I want to be able to talk to my students about it. Give me some frameworks. Give me the logic. Give me an analysis about how I should think about that. Something that could work.
Like that's an interesting question. So, like, what turned out, like you said, the panel of experts on Cracker Barrel said, no, no, it wasn't a bad logo, it wasn't a bad legacy. You didn't have to change it, and you shouldn't have. That's basically what ended up happening. But your question is a broader one, I think. What happens when you really do have a bad legacy and you do have to change it?
yeah.
Yes.
That hasn't been the case for Cracker Barrel. Wasn't
Yes.
the case for Gap when it
Yep.
happened to Gap either. That American legacy was really working for them. But if you do have something that's bad, like, and we have seen it with Aunt Jemima, for
Ooh.
example, there
Right.
was nobody who didn't think that that logo should have been changed. Now, what they did was what's called a silver bullet. And because they knew it was bad, they just killed it with a really bold statement. More often than not, it's not that black and white
Yep.
as bad, good,
Yep.
but it's more something, it's a little out of date. We got to modernize it. And then the more sophisticated logos, they don't stay the same, actually. They move, but they
Right.
move in very small movements, very carefully thought out. So if you look at their logo at one point in time and you look 10 years later, it isn't the same one, but it never happened as a really big move.
Mhm.
It happened very slowly, paying attention to things,
Mm.
pulling out the things that are no longer culturally relevant, putting in the things that are, but
Mm.
doing it kind of under the radar to not
Mm-hmm.
to not generate this word of mouth. But you have to be sophisticated
Yeah.
and paying attention to your logo and to your audience to really manage your brand equity and brand assets appropriately. That's what I think you should be doing. And
Interesting.
that's why you should be paying your marketing CMOs the big bucks because they should be paying attention to this. It's not easy. It requires a lot of experience and a lot of sophistication. Do you agree with that, Americus?
I definitely agree with that. Daphne, what are you seeing with respect to, folks that are in the C-suite? Because I'm hearing a lot of this notion of the chief marketing officer, Barbara, and the sort of the role kind of morphing into something that is much different, perhaps, than what was thought, perhaps in the past, in the sense that the chief marketing officer has to also be a little bit of the chief tech officer, a little bit of the finance officer, because the brand is an asset. So are you seeing that, to Barbara's point, Daphne, that the leadership that is in charge of these things that Barbara's talking about, developing the strategy, putting it out there and executing on it appropriately, are you seeing these different skill sets? And you can talk about AI and all other things as well, but different skill sets that are required to be, quote, the CMO, the person that's in charge of this very delicate asset that can, as we saw with Cracker Barrel, can go haywire in an instant. So are you seeing that in terms of the C-suite leadership that you are interviewing and talking with, Daphne?
We're definitely seeing that. I think just as a reporter, I have more questions of people like you and the companies themselves than, answers. I think that especially when it comes to apparel, the merchants are I think there's a little bit of not tension, but there's push and pull around who the audience is and what our products actually are. And then there's the question around not just logos, but the kinds of marketing that you saw from American Eagle and Gap, where you're trying to have a conversation
Hmm.
and, it's just so complex.
Let's switch gears to another story you wrote because I want to cover some. You have so much to talk about. I want to cover some other
Wait a
things
minute, hold
here.
on, Barbara. You want to cover Victoria's Secret? Wait a minute. I have no problem with that. Do you want to? Sorry.
Exactly. Victoria's Secret. Talk about a brand with a controversial legacy.
Yep.
So what's going on? That's an interesting brand though, because they're finally kind of getting some of it right. Victoria's Secret's their mainstay, their big brand, Victoria's Secret. Then they have the trendy brand Pink. So this is another one. Is it good to build on their legacy? Is it not? What are they doing? What are you seeing with Victoria's Secret?
I honestly, it's no accident that Gap has a CEO who's only been there for 2 years. Um, and Victoria's Secret has a CEO who's only been there for a year.
Wow.
And each of them seems to understand what was needed and they're starting to execute. Um, Hillary Super, who used to be at the Fenty lingerie brand, Savage, um, she seems to understand the what Victoria's Secret customer wants, that it doesn't necessarily mean not being sexy.
Hmm.
It just doesn't mean being sexist. And there
Oh,
was a
wow. You
sort
just came
of
up with a fantastic
conf-
tagline, I think. That was really good.
well, I think they got
He's sexy, not
confused.
sexist.
They were
Interesting.
really over on one end for a while there and
Yeah.
just didn't get rid of those old guys who couldn't stop talking even when everyone was telling them to shut up. And then they sort of overcorrected and didn't want to um talk about sexiness and underwear, which it's not the golden arches or the old man on the Cracker Barrel logo, but it's kind of close for Victoria's Secret.
Yeah.
Um but then they brought back the Victoria's Angel fashion show, so that was a little confusing. I feel like this company now has leadership that understands what young customers want from a lingerie brand that is capable of being comfortable and sexy and not sexist.
Americas, this is right to your point, and I'd like to hear you comment on it because this is something with a legacy that's potentially controversial. But maybe in its original intent wasn't supposed to be controversial. It kind of got, in a little way, brand napped and pushed in a direction that wasn't comfortable for them. And then you got to navigate how you build on a legacy because Victoria's Secret definitely had a strong
Big
legacy.
time. Yeah.
Avoid the pitfalls of bad politics or sexism or things like that that most people don't like, but you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Americas, do you have a framework for that? I mean, in your brand identity, I imagine it comes up a lot when you think about it. It's not a simple concept. It is a complicated concept.
It's an extremely complicated concept, Barbara. I think that, we're starting to lay out some of the key areas and issues, right? And I think it's the general notion where you've developed something and there's a core group of people who are with you on that something. And now you're trying to grow and do other things. And, the same customers, to Barbara's point, Daphne, do not stay in the market forever. So you can't be sitting there thinking that, okay, this is gonna I have to be doing the same sorts of things. And so I think part of it, Barbara, is your point, which is how do I think about my core and how do I think about expanding my core, but doing it in a way that's the folks who are the OGs, if you will, embrace and want to actually maybe that's part of it, Barbara, where you get the core and you have them help you bring in new people based on kind of their credibility with the brand. And so it's becomes like a kumbaya moment, maybe, Barbara, to help sort of, grow in a way that doesn't create factions where you've got the people who are like, no, we're old school Victoria's Secret. You got the new people who are like,
Mhm.
no, we're the sexy but not sexist group. So how do you I think that's part of it, Barbara, is like trying to, again, stepping back and trying to say, how do we keep the community whole and grow it at the same time? How do we make sure that everyone that's involved in the community feels like they have some psychological ownership and that kind of thing as we grow forward? What are you guys' thoughts on that? Does that sound like it might be,
Yeah, I
on the
just
right
want to weigh
direction?
in and then I'm going to let you have the last word on this, Daphne. But I think that that's actually the advantage of this community building because it is a little messy and you got to kind of think about it and you got to work it and you got to build on what's good and figure out what to throw out and but give everybody some ownership. And if you allow people to participate in creating this community, I think the end result a couple misses, hopefully mostly hits,
Hmm.
but you get a lot more loyalty. I mean, if people are part of the community, part of creating what this brand means going on, I think you're going to get a much stronger community, a much stronger ownership than in the old days when you would hire, the advertising guru who sat on the hill and threw things down and everybody just had to accept it. I
Yep.
think people like the community building. And maybe because of that, they embrace some of the messiness. The messiness is
Mm.
almost part of it, as long as you can come out of it in a good way.
Hmm. What are your thoughts, Daphne, on that analysis?
My thoughts are actually questions to you for the decline of Victoria's Secret and their jumbled messaging, their jumbled maybe their loss of their own sense of self. Um, really opened the door to a lot of DTC companies that took literally were taking share. I mean, we know that, they know that. Um, Now DTC sort of learned some hard lessons. It's not that easy to sell online, blah blah blah. And so I feel like there is an opportunity for Victoria's Secret to yank some of that back. But what do you do if you're a DTC company? You do have a little bit of name recognition, but you didn't maybe get it over the hill. Like,
Yeah, well,
what should they be
that's a really
doing?
good That's a good point. I mean, talking about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, Gap had incredible scale. I mean, some people thought they overstored and had to pull some of that back, but
Yeah.
they had the scale. So did Victoria's Secret have the scale. And these little DTC brands, they are, like you said, they didn't get over the hump. That's the really big deal. If you don't build your niche big enough to get over that hump so that you continue to have a stake in the ground, you're going to be out when everybody starts coming for you and for your market share.
Interesting.
So for the small brands, maybe you get that brand identity, that loyalty with a very small sliver of customers. But if you can't grow that,
Mm.
when the big guys come after you and learn their lessons, you're not going to survive. So it's kind of war out there. Americus, you got a take on that? Like the
Oh,
small
you know what?
versus
I
the
was gonna actually. I think this is a perfect moment to talk about the con matrix because I think this is part of what your analysis looks at, right, Barbara? In terms of what are the quadrants that define growth, and this is huge because I just got finished, Daphne, listening to Barbara's Ripple Effect podcast with Dan Loney on the same Wharton podcast network. And the idea, your point, Daphne, about DTC not having an experience to now leverage
Mhm.
is huge, right? In the sense of, perhaps being a disadvantage. So maybe Barbara, could you, what does that analysis say? If you're in the DTC quadrant, how are you thinking about these different sorts of things to be able to get over that hump? And
well,
what are the next steps to be able to do that?
and one of the things we are seeing, Daphne, and I know you're seeing this too, you're making a different point on scale, but one of the things we're seeing with the DTC brands, typically they were online brands and they
Mhm.
didn't have the physical store presence that Gap has, that Victoria's Secret has, where you can, and Lulu has, for example, where you're creating these brand communities, these in store experiences in person.
Hmm.
And if you don't have some kind of experience like that, and you're not big enough to really scale, you kind of get caught between the crosshairs. And I think we are seeing we are, even though there's stores are closing, we are seeing a emphasis on building the right in-store experience, the
Yes,
right
yes,
retail experience
yes,
that merges with a very strong brand identity that kind of has to tinker with the changing times.
yes,
But you really want to create that physical in-store experience
yes,
for a
yes,
lot of these brands,
yes,
which you don't really get if it's all online.
yeah,
Most of the more successful DTCs have managed their store experience appropriately. Some of them opened too many stores and that was bad. Some of them didn't have enough stores and that was bad. But building some kind of real physical community experience,
yeah.
I think really helps these retailers. Well, we could talk about this for a long time. And I know we had another story we were going to talk to you about, Daphne. So we're going to have to bring you back. But we're out of time right now. So let me thank you for joining us today and remind us where our listeners can go to keep up with you and your stories and what's happening in Retail Dive.
So great to be here as always. You can find my stories at Retail Dive, retaildive.com. We're all advertising supported, so free to read. Sign up for a newsletter. We're a daily, so we've
Oh,
got a lot,
nice.
and talking to people like you. So we've got a lot of good stuff in there.
Excellent.
That's great. Thank you very much. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank our producers, Dion Simpkins and Marissa Rena. Thank you all for listening today. We'll be back next week. Till then, this has been Marketing Matters on the Wharton Podcast Network. I'm Barbara Kahn here with Americus Read.